Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell warned on Wednesday that President Donald Trump's big policy shifts on tariffs are unlike anything seen in modern history, putting the Federal Reserve in uncharted waters. These are very fundamental policy changes, Powell said at an event hosted by the Economic Club of Chicago. There isn't a modern experience for how to think about this. Powell said the level of the tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and that the lingering uncertainty around tariffs could inflict lasting economic damage. With Trump's tariffs putting the economy on a path toward weaker growth, higher unemployment, and faster inflation, all at the same time, the Fed is also facing a situation it hasn't dealt with in about half a century. We may find ourselves in a challenging scenario in which our dual mandate goals are in tension, Powell said. U.S. stocks crashed as Powell spoke. The Dow was down 700 points, or 1.7%. The broader S&P fell over 2.5%. The tech-heavy Nasdaq fell 3.5%. The Federal Reserve is responsible for full employment and taming inflation, but Trump's tariffs threaten both of these goals now. Jerome Powell said the Federal Reserve's best move for the moment is to be neutral in action until the data clearly shows how the U.S. economy is responding to Trump's negative price hike policies. It's only a matter of time until Trump's tariffs push up inflation, push up unemployment, and weaken economic growth of the United States, according to most economists, especially if the massive reciprocal tariffs that went into effect briefly on April 9th are put back in place. Trump delayed the historic tax hike on the poor and rich from import taxes until July. So far, Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel, 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada that aren't compliant with the free trade agreement, a massive 145% duty on Chinese imports, a 25% tariff on cars, with separate tariffs on auto parts coming out at a later date, and a 10% baseline tariffs on all U.S. imports. The administration also introduced temporary exemptions for some electronic goods, and Trump has said the separate tariffs are likely coming down the pike on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, copper, and timber. So building houses are going to start getting very expensive. Jerome Powell said just lay down the law with Trump. David Russell, global head of market strategy at Trade Station, said in a commentary issued Wednesday, it was clear warning about that stagflation and a declaration that the Fed won't enable the White House with rate cuts. So stagflation is where basically we have inflation and no growth in the economy. The Fed might be confronted with a challenge it hasn't dealt with in decades. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the U.S. economy suffered periods of high unemployment and double-digit inflation, a troublesome combination known as stagflation. Back then, under the leadership of Fed Chair Paul Volcker, the Fed prioritized fighting inflation, even if it meant inflicting some economic pain. The U.S. economy seems to be heading in that direction, according to most forecasts, but it's unclear whether or not it will fully reach that point. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee said last week at an event in New York that Trump's tariffs are putting the central bank in the same tough spot. A tariff is like a negative supply shock. That's a stagflationary shock, which is to say it makes both sides of the Fed's dual mandate worse at the same time, he said. Prices are going up while jobs are being lost and growth is coming down. And there is not a generic playbook for how the central bank should respond to a stagflationary shock. Powell said if stagflation does become a reality, we would consider how far the economy is from each goal and the potential for the different time horizons over which those respective gaps would be anticipated to close. We understand that the elevated levels of unemployment or inflation can be damaging and painful for communities, families, and businesses, he said. Several Fed officials have said that the central bank should keep a close eye on people's perception of prices, which have deteriorated based on the University of Michigan's closely watched consumer survey. It's actually the worst in decades. It's unclear at what point rising inflation expectations would prompt any action from the Fed and what those moves will be. And inflation, although substantially below a 4-decade peak reached in June 2022, is still above the Fed's 2% target, meaning the Fed has less of a reason to resume cutting interest rates. And for now, most officials seem to agree that it's best to wait for any evidence to show up in the data more strongly. This is a difficult set of risks for monetary policy to navigate, Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack said Wednesday at an event in Columbus, Ohio. Given the economy's starting point, with both sides of our mandate expected to be under pressure, there's a strong case to hold monetary policy steady in order to balance the risk coming from further elevated inflation and a slowing labor market. When clarity is hard to come by, waiting for additional data will help inform the path ahead, she added.